Nancy is author of over 100 articles, I'm not going to list them all here, and several books, including most recently Chinese Architecture in an Age of Turmoil, 200 to 600, and Chinese Early Mosques. And Nancy's received numerous grants from such places as the Guggenheim Foundation, Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and others. In addition to all this, Nancy still finds time to make herself a highly valued member of the Penn Museum community. In the realm of exhibits, in teaching with our collections, in lectures like this one, and in day-to-day counsel. I didn't want to pass up this opportunity to thank her for that. So now I invite you all to welcome our speaker and enjoy what I know is going to be a fascinating talk on the Forbidden City, Emperors, Ritual, Residence, and City. Nancy.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to see a packed auditorium. We're in the rainy because renovations are going on downstairs, and I think I speak for the whole staff at the museum in saying that we're looking forward to packed auditoriums downstairs in the Harrison in the future. The last time I did one of those lectures, the Phillies were in the World Series, and so you know how long ago that was. It was a Silk Road show. And one of the guards was standing at the back giving me the score that I was announcing. And we, of course, had we had to postpone this because of snow last week. But had it been tomorrow, if the Quakers were actually playing right now, we would probably have a small screen right here. And that's relevant to contemporary China, where I will get before the end, and it will take me close to an hour, so if you do have to leave, feel free. My charge tonight was to talk about 4 subjects: emperors, ritual, residence includes gardens, and of course the city itself, the Forbidden City. Anyone who's ever seen the Forbidden City, especially people who don't grow up in China, including Penn's own urban historian, the late Ed Bacon, have called it the greatest city in the world. If you don't remember the name Ed Bacon, he's the one that you saw on public television trying to convince the city to stay lower than William Penn's hat. He lost that battle. But you'll see when we talk about the Forbidden City, probably why one of the reasons he liked it is because it was and still is such a low city. Marco Polo called it the greatest city in the world, interestingly, because he called several cities in China the greatest city in the world, including Hangzhou. Bannister Fletcher, who's a name that you might not know, didn't call it the greatest city in the world, but he wrote a book that's now in its 21st edition. He wrote the first edition in the late 19th century, and now the Royal Academy of Architecture in Great Britain continues to publish this book on world architecture. So he was global before it became popular to be global, but he recognized that China was part of the world of global architecture, and he chose a building from the Forbidden City when describing China. Many in the 18th century who saw it and a few who didn't, one, Jean-Baptiste de Halde, knew that all of China's cities were walled, and this is a fact. The word for wall and the word for city are the same in China, but he also knew what any school child in China knows today, any kindergartner, that the city of Beijing is recognizable because it is a vertical rectangle and a horizontal rectangle underneath it. We'll see how this all came into place. Also, Thomas Hanforth won the Caldecott Medal in 1939 for a wonderful book that was read to me as a child, that I read my children, and I haven't been able to find my copy of it. I was able to get this picture off the web, but a girl named Mei Li, who's about 5 years old, tells the story of Chinese New Year's. And she tells it as her house inside a courtyard, inside a wall, and how she walks around the walled city and has the wall that is the Great Wall behind her. The Forbidden City and the Walled City are the two fundamental symbols of the city, Beijing. Ripley told his audiences that the Forbidden City and the Great Wall could be seen from air. He couldn't prove it, but in the 1990s, air satellites did find Beijing, and did map Beijing, and what you're seeing here, photograph it. This is the vertical rectangle, and you are noticing that the horizontal rectangle is missing. This is something that you're going to hear about today also. So a city of walls, including old pictures of walls like the one on the left that you may wonder why you keep seeing. I'll tell you the reason for that also. But a city of walls with this fundamental building as the prime symbol. One usually begins the story of Beijing with this man, the Yongle emperor. You have his dates. He's the fourth son of the founding emperor of the dynasty called Ming, and so we'll get to that in a moment also. But people always hope in a lecture like this that there will be a few things that you learn that you haven't read in the books. So the first thing that you may or may not know is that the city of Beijing traces its continuous history from the year 900. They're actually archaeological remains from the 2nd century BCE, but that when Yongle came to this city, he saw remains like a pagoda from Liao and the tombs of emperors from Qin, and this pagoda, and these all still can be seen if you visit Beijing today from the Yuan, and notice that the sizes of each of those cities are superimposed on the vertical and the horizontal rectangle. But the city Beijing that we talk about today really traces its origins to Kublai Khan. One of the things that you'll hear about Kublai Khan is that he saw the spoils of a place within a walled city, and so decided that he should build it. That's not as true as people used to think. Riding across the grasslands of Mongolia, Kublai saw a host of cities, most of them probably originally inspired by China, but these ruins survive from the 9th century, and these ruins survive from the 11th century. And the first city that Kublai himself ever built was a city that's called in Chinese Shangdu. So this is the Xanadu of Coleridge's poem. And it is a city with 3 walls. What we're going to call the Palace City, where the emperor lives, and the Imperial City for the offices of government, and the outer city, and in this case it's very large, and then hunting ground around it. But the actual city inside the second wall looked like this and was designed by the man whose statue, we don't know if it's a portrait or not, but the man whose statue you see on the right, a man named Liu Bingjong, you have his dates, who designed this city according to the 8 fundamental trigrams of the Book of Changes, the I Ching. And what is perceived from a mapped plan of the city is that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 monastery remains from 8 quadrants around the city. Having successfully moved south from this walled city that he built, Kublai built a city on beneath the city that's today Beijing. And this is the city that he built with a palace area and an imperial city around it, and then an outer wall with strict north-south and east-west streets. Liu Bingjong designed it also, and he placed something called a center marker right here and built a pavilion over it, so that's what you're seeing right here, and then measured out equidistant north, south, and east, west. based on a city that was described in classical texts, meaning from the middle of the first millennium BCE, the idealized city of a Chinese ruler, what's called the ruler's city. So Kublai is the first one in the history of China who ever manages to build a city based on the classical Mongol. The convert, in other words, follows the orthodox system. What this offered Kublai is what it offers anyone within the Chinese walls. He lived when he was in the city, including with relatives of his, in tents within wall-enclosed sectors so that he had the total privacy to live within the walls. And he built his city on two sides of this artificial body of water that had been channeled in by the dynasty called Jin before him. The Mongols liked the idea of being near a water source, and also for practical reasons. It was a good thing to have water nearby. So, how does Yongle come to be here? Yongle's father, the Hongwu emperor, had 26 sons and 14 daughters, and more than one wife. And so his solution to keeping the peace was to give each of his sons who lived to adulthood a part of China, to divide China into fiefdoms. And Yongle, who was considered one of the more successful sons, I've already told you, the fourth son, was given the fiefdom called Yan, which was one of the ancient names for the territory around Beijing. He came here in 1368 when the Mongols were chased out of China. His father built a capital in what's today Nanjing. It means southern capital, because there was still a lot of loyalty to the Mongols in the north. And he initially moved the wall south. This distance is 2.9 kilometers. So he moved the wall south so that he had a smaller city to protect. That's what you see here. And he bided his time. One thing that he did in 1396 was to tear down a lot of what remained of Kublai's city, but he had a scribe record all the buildings so that he knew exactly what had been there and where he would find it. The father expected, would live his life as a wealthy prince, would get a tomb like this one. There's evidence of the wealth of the princes from the Ming dynasty all over China, even in a place in the south, very remote place called Guilin. And the princes had objects like this inside of their tombs, so they did very well. But when his father died in 1398, the oldest son was already deceased. And so the oldest son of the oldest son became the second emperor, and Yongle didn't like that. He thought that he was more talented and more deserving than his nephew, and so he took some troops south, had a small war, conquered his nephew, came back north, and should at that point have begun building his capital. But at that point, his wife, who you see here, was sick, and she died in 1407. So the first thing he did was build the Ming Tombs. His own tomb first, that he shares with his wife. They're buried beneath this mound. This is the Sacrificial Hall. This is the path leading up to it, the so-called Spirit Path. If you've been to Beijing and you've gone to the Ming Tombs, it was built by Yongle. He doesn't actually move into the Forbidden City until 1421. What we call the Forbidden City is the area within the innermost wall. It's called the Palace City here. You can use either name. That was surrounded by a moat. So remember, Kublai had architecture over here, but this is Yongle's palace. This is where the imperial government functions. He kept the water source. And then he built this, and there were two altars, one for sacrifices to heaven and one for sacrifices to agriculture. Within his Forbidden City, the conception was a city of 3 courts and 5 gates. Odd numbers are auspicious in China, even numbers are inauspicious. Odd numbers represent men, even numbers represent women. So the 5 gates was easy, beginning with Tiananmen, the famous Tianan Gate that we all know, which is right here, Tianan Gate, and then Duan Gate, and then the entrance, and then Duan Gate, and then the entrance to the Forbidden City today, that's Wu Gate, that's where you pay your admission fee to enter, and then the crossing water, then the entrance to this courtyard, and the entrance to this courtyard. Some of your books refer to the Forbidden City as just having 2 courts, the inner court and the outer court, or the governing court where the emperor held audience, and the court where he slept, the resting court. But since that's only 2, the other understanding is that the 2 are the inner courts, and that this area, which no longer looks the way it did at the time of Yongle, would be the 3rd court, the outer court, actually for governance. The most important buildings within the Forbidden City are what you see here, and the 3 great halls, or the 3 front halls, are these, and they are elevated on a capital I-shaped triple level platform, large, small, large, and these are equidistant. This hall, the Hall of Supreme Harmony, is the most important building in the Forbidden City. It is where 24 emperors were enthroned. Banquets were held with 108 tables. 9 is an extremely auspicious number, 3 squared, 3 times 3. So 108 tables would be set up for the New Year's celebration, for the winter solstice. There would be festivals honoring longevity. There was a festival for 70-year-olds. There was also a festival for 80-year-olds, and invitations would go out as far beyond Beijing as the census records could keep track of the population. An emperor might have a wedding here. Sometimes it was held in another hall, and imperial edicts were proclaimed here. Successful candidates in the imperial exams were announced here. The middle hall was kind of a staging hall. Now, this is another myth that I will break down for you. I'm showing you this picture. The old understanding was that this was the epicenter, the true center of the imperial universe of China, if you will, the middle of these halls. It isn't. I'm going to show you later on what it is. But this was a kind of staging hall. The emperor would come here to go over his address before he went to the altars of heaven, earth, the sun, the moon, soil, grain, and agriculture, and he performed a ceremony here with an ox leading a plow, and the officials dressed up like farmers, and singers sang songs, and so that's what went on in this little hall. And then the 3rd hall, the Hall for the Preservation of Harmony, was also used for imperial banquets. The crown prince received his title here. There could be banquets for a daughter's marriage, that is, the wedding would take place in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, and then the banquet might take place back here. And in 1789, the final test in the civil service examination was held there. Chinese architecture always tells you a lot about itself. This kind of roof with only 5 ridges is used for a more important building than a building with gables. 2 sets of eaves are going to be more important than 1, and so supreme harmony, central harmony, preservation of harmony. At one point, there were only 2 back halls, and in the 16th century, the 3rd one was added. Originally, the emperor held court here, and then he slept here. In later times, this palace complex and this palace complex were built. By later, I mean 17th, 18th centuries. And so this became the empress's space, and she held audience here, and then this would be her residential chamber. Sometimes the wedding night was consummated in this room, and at that time it was completely decorated in red, which is the most auspicious color in China. So what about this fourth wall, the outer city? It's going to be built in the 1550s by this man, the Jiajing Emperor, who went over all the rituals of the court with his ministers and decided that too much attention had been given to the imperial ancestors who were worshipped here and to the sacrifices to soil and grain that took place here. And instead, he thought that worship of the heavens and the emperor's opportunity to speak to the heavens should be more important. And so he added this wall in the 1550s so that the two altars could be incorporated. And by that point, still the Forbidden City, the Imperial City, because it's closer to the center, this is inner and this is outer. So the city continues. The names of buildings change somewhat. I'm using the names that you read on labels when you go to China today, which are really the 17th or 18th century names of the last dynasty, which is called Qing. And we can refer to it as the long 18th century. That is the two emperors who reigned for 60 years, Kangxi, who dies in 1722, his famous grandson Qianlong, who resigns after 60 years out of respect to his grandfather, and then continuing to about 1820. By 1840, there's a lot of chaos already in the city of Beijing, but it's at this point that the residential palaces that I mentioned were built, and also the scenes from buildings that have recently become open. The famous Qianlong residences and Qianlong gardens have recently opened, and these are the places. This is actually a painting, but this is trompe-l'oeil, which is a technique that the painters learned from European painters. So the Yangxin and the Ningxiu palaces were built. Again, this is all hasn't been open through the history of modern China, but these are all open places that you can see today. Gardens were very much part of the concept of imperial rule. There were also 5 of these that joined with 3 hills. So the Summer Palace is one of the gardens. Many of you have probably been there. The famous European mansions or Western mansions designed by Europeans and ironically destroyed by them. And then the Fragrant Hills is one of the 3 hills. And this is where the Biyun Monastery is. The concept of the garden being crucial to the imperial plan was fundamental to the city of Beijing, to the Forbidden City, and the emperors of the Qing dynasty, especially Kangxi and Qianlong, used to go on tours. They were called inspection tours of all of their lands. The tours were painted, and they would see scenes that they liked in one part of China, especially in South China, and they would then construct what was called a borrowed view. So they would see something in the south, and then they would bring it north and build it. The same process was in place when the Qing emperors conquered people. At its zenith, the Qing Empire extended from Korea in the east beyond Tibet and beyond places like Kazakhstan in the west. And so one of their summer resorts, it's about 2-hour drive from Beijing. Of course, when I say that, it always depends on Beijing traffic, but it's something around 100 kilometers from Beijing. They borrowed monasteries of people they conquered and brought them into a politically inspired, detached palace area. So the most interesting of what they built was a copy of the Potala Palace in Tibet, but this is modeled after a garden from the south, and this is a monastery that they had seen in the west, etc., etc. So the emperors had no problem bringing into the Forbidden City or Greater Beijing that they occupied anything that was for their pleasure. And the other reason that people keep coming back to the Forbidden City is because all the principles of Chinese architecture really exist there. the concept of the long north-south axis and southern orientation. On the right, a monastery from the 11th century. Flat, low space. This was the comment I made before. Buddhism comes to China, it becomes a Chinese religion, a pagoda takes on the features of Chinese architecture. But it sticks out, it projects, almost like a sore thumb on the low-built environment of China, and it moves around in space, and sometimes a monastery doesn't have one. Chinese architecture is low. It builds around courtyards, and the capital I-shaped courtyard is for imperial space. We never think of a Chinese building as a single structure. I say palace, but we're not talking about one building. We're actually talking about a complex of buildings, among which one of them is always clearly the most important, this one, and it's the five-spine roof, or this one. The gate is extremely important. It marks the division between more sacred or more important space behind the inner court, or the inner city, and more profane space in front of it. This one, it would be, guess what she's thinking. The point I'm making here is how human-sized Chinese architecture is. This is a subtle point, but it's extremely important. And this has to do with the fact that space in the Forbidden City is extremely low. If you've walked the axis, you might be panting by the time you finish, but you've walked 1-point-something kilometers. You're panting because you've gone upstairs, over a threshold, through a gate, above and down a threshold, downstairs. Now you're coming here upstairs, threshold straight, threshold down, and you've done this something like 20 times on the main axis. But the fact is, a person is between 1/3 and 1/2 as tall as the pillar, and it is a one-story structure. So this is where someone begins to think, what is really going on in this architectural system? It is modular. In fact, if your craftsman knows these dimensions, the cross-section of a bracket arm, he can build anything. It's modular, and it's ranked, and it's adaptable. So that I'm inside the Hall of Supreme Harmony on the left. If you're enjoying looking at these pictures, it's a good time to go back and look at the movie The Last Emperor. This is where the story is filmed. But on the right is an important Buddhist monastery. And the space is interchangeable because they are both using the module for China's most important architecture. These two buildings are contemporary. It's not what you would assume. You would assume the one on the left is later. No, it's just more eminent. Chinese architecture is heavily polychromed, whether it's a Buddhist cave or a building from the Summer Palace, and privacy is possible. It's a system whose walls make it possible to be private and, for instance, live inside of a tent. Of course, Chinese architecture evolves. A Chinese building, an old wooden building, can usually be dated within 100 years. That dating, without scientific, without dendrochronology or measuring, but by how many bracket sets there are between the columns, by the size of the bracket set compared to the column, and by the slope of the roof. But nevertheless, the fundamental features, like the capital I-shaped platform, trace through more than 2 millennia, and these changes and these long continuities over time are not superficial. So we're looking at wood preserved from 5000 BCE that's used in construction. I'm looking at an architectural manual on the right, and I'm looking at the notching in reconstruction of a building in the Forbidden City. It's the same wooden system. This idea of the module is something that current research is confirming wasn't just used in buildings. It was used through the entire city. So that, for instance, the outer wall of the Forbidden City is 753 by 961 meters. So 753 by 961. This ends up being 1/9 of this distance. This distance is 1/2 of this distance. The proportions top to bottom and left to right are the same as the proportions in the back, and this is also true for all the buildings through the Imperial City. This is true of the residential palaces. This is true of the side residential palaces. And so here now I'm showing you how people now know that what the true center of the Forbidden City was. It is the Hall of Supreme Harmony, which makes much more sense than this. And you see it probably right, you see it right here. This actually hits the Hall of Supreme Harmony, and it's number 3 on the left. So what people perceived because of measurement turns out not exactly to be true. So we understand, therefore, this kind of comparison. They're both imperial buildings. On the left, the Hall of Supreme Harmony. On the right, the Sacrificial Hall from the Yongle Emperor at the Ming Tombs. So 1424, and the Forbidden City is last largely restored in the 18th century. But in fact, as you look through this system, as you take a broader view, even if you look at a pagoda that's dated 1056, you are looking at elevation on a platform, a timber frame, bracket sets that interface that frame with the next level, and ceramic tile roofs. So that I can tell you that this is one of the purest imperial buildings that survives from the time of Kublai Khan. So we can call it either palatial, or maybe we can call it Confucian or imperial. One of these is Buddhist and one of these is Taoist. And if I ask you to guess, you have a 50% chance of being right, but unless you read Chinese and know that this title would only be used for a Taoist building, you don't know. And the one on the left is Confucian, and this on the right is a reconstruction of the synagogue in Kaifeng, and left is a mosque, and right is a residence, and left is a funerary hall, and right is a garden, even inside a garden. So when you begin to process what's going on, you have to say, why is it that the emperor is living in a building that really is made the same way as almost any other building in China? It's question that people grapple with. I'll show you in passing why it is, why I think it is, but what I can tell you is that this ability to adapt space and alter space within the same system is possible only within the Chinese system. The entire outer structure never has to be torn down, and the buildings are multifunctional. So if you were surprised when I said the emperor is living in a building not just made out of wood, but by the same system that a humble house is constructed with, well, the fact is every piece of wood in the Hall of Supreme Harmony is straight. There are 10,000 of them, but there isn't even one curved timber. The plan is hypostyle, complete grid. It's the decoration that overwhelms you. It's the gold and the silver and the mother of pearl and the dragons and the pedestals and the painting on the bracket sets, because it's really all just backdrop. The Forbidden City is the emperor's city. It is completely forbidden to anyone except the emperor to ever enter it. Now, this continuity that I've just mentioned, people in this room also, I think, have looked at Chinese paintings and are probably interested in painting. So the logical thing to say at this point, well, isn't this more generally true? Chinese artists, artisans like to capture the spirit of antiquity in their craft. Well, yes, I can show you, it's a drawing for, the actual painting no longer survives, a painting from the 11th century and a painting from the year 1300, and artists, yes, they sat at court and copied using copybooks. But in the 17th century, and certainly, and even before, but easily one can prove that in the 17th century the system breaks down, and this is the real difference. A painting can be rolled up, can be put in a sleeve, it can be put in a closet, it can be aired. A painting is small and just a dot in this universe of imperial production, even if it's made at the court. Whether it's the Forbidden City or the house of a family house in the countryside, it requires an organized labor force, lots of time. It's one of the greatest expenses that a family or the empire will ever have to face, and it's assumed that it will change the environment long after the person who builds it is no longer here. But all of that said, this repetition and this reuse of the timber frame and this module means that it was indeed an illiterate labor force who built the Forbidden City with directions from craftsmen, master craftsmen, who may or may not have been literate, with directions from the court who told them what they wanted. This is what it also meant, not just for Kublai Khan. What it meant is that anyone from the outside was in awe of this environment, and all that he needed to see were the golden roofs projecting above the low walls and say, I want to conquer that, I want that to be mine, because it represents the clearest symbol of strong China. And that, quite honestly, I think is why the system didn't change. And the other aspect of that is that one always can see China anywhere that someone decides to position China. So that when William Chambers, well, you can say it's for exotica, but one can also say this is empire. For the British Empire just decided to put China right inside of their gardens because they control China. End of the 19th century, Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen decides to put this pavilion. You can be anywhere in the world, but when you see China, it is a clear, unambiguous symbol. So that the next question someone can ask is that, is it really different from the classical tradition in one important way? Classical tradition was built to endure for several thousand years. Chinese buildings are timber frame. The wood rots. The good side of that is that one pillar can be replaced and the rest of the building doesn't have to be changed. But this is a system of perishable materials that's meant to endure for millennia, which it did. So, the Forbidden City, as I mentioned, is just this small part of Beijing, but Beijing is without a doubt the emperor's city and was until the fall of Imperial China. So that when the Jiajing emperor walled the southern extension in the 1550s, the part that he included, that he kept within the walls, was a capital I-shaped set of 3 altars. It's this same capital I-shaped plan. This is the famous Temple of Heaven, where we see circular buildings that represent the heavens, and the 4 sides represent Earth. 3 of them, of course, because it's an odd number. And the outer wall also combines the circle and the square to give us the horseshoe shape. So the Temple of Heaven also was built on a modular grid modular system. In fact, everything's been measured, it's now been proved that nothing in that Imperial China touched was not built on the modular measured system. We have records of what the Temple of Heaven looked like from the time of the Jiajing Emperor, 1550s, when he did the reconstruction. So 3 parts. The emperor used to enter on the east. He came here 3 times a year. He came at the summer solstice, he came at the winter solstice, and he came on New Year's Day. And when he came on New Year's Day, no one was allowed to walk outside because, and actually there's a line in the book Mei Li about it. Everybody will go home and look on the web. I've looked for the book too. It's very hard to find that book. But the city was supposed to be silent because no one was allowed to see the emperor, and it would not have been desirable to see him by accident. So he came the night before. He stayed over here in what was called a hall of abstinence. He abstained from sexual relations and he abstained from certain foods to put himself psychologically in the right mood to talk to the heavens. This was the one time, or these were the 2 times of the year, the 2 solstices being the most important, when he could actually communicate with the gods on high, whoever they were, and make his supplications for a prosperous year. He came first to this mound, circular mound, whose flagstones are multiples of 9 up to 360. In the last ring, he came up, he bowed, he came down, he passed through more gates. He came to this small building that wasn't part of the original Temple of Heaven concept, but comes to be the Imperial Vault of Heaven. And this is a building which was designed with acoustical effects in the 16th century. This has never worked for me, but people say it's worked for them. So it's said that if you say something on step 1, you get an echo. Step 2, you get 2 echoes. And step 3, you get 3 echoes. It's always crowded. So it's not clear if it would ever work, but you'll read this in the books. And then if you stand 180 degrees from someone on any side of this and whisper into the wall, the other person is supposed to hear you. So this kind of, again, is a staging hall that sets a person up for one of the rare 3-roofed structures. This is the hall for prayer for a prosperous year, but it's better known as the Temple of Heaven. The emperor went in. There wasn't a set prayer. There's no text that he says. This is where he speaks to the heavens and talks about what he hopes will happen in the future. Everything inside is symbolic, and interestingly, these are, well, the number 12 is a multiple of 3, but these are really even numbers. So there are 12 pillars beneath the lowest roof, which represent the 12 divisions of the Chinese day. We have 24 hours. Chinese day was divided into 12 watches. Second roof is supported by 12 pillars that represent the 12 lunar months, and the top level is supported by 4 pillars that represent the seasons. In and around this city are all the other altars. So the moon and the sun and the earth, heaven is here, agriculture is here. There's still an ancestral temple. There's still an altar of soil and grain. There's still an altar of silkworms, so that at the beginning of the last Chinese dynasty, Qing, there were more than 50 days that the emperor was supposed to perform ritual. And by the year 1905, shortly before the end of the last Chinese dynasty, which happens in 1911, the emperor performs 83 annual rituals at all the various altars. They're all open tourist sites now. They weren't. This is what the temple to the ancestors looks like. There are tablets of the emperors of the current dynasty inside. Emperors of previous dynasties have tablets with their name, which are placed flat on pillows. And it is, again, a capital I-shaped structure. Under Communist China, it became a workers' palace, but it's now again an open tourist site. In fact, it's a very popular place for weddings in China. And so that was right here. And then on the other side, the altars of soil and grain became a public park. But when Sun Yat-sen, first president of China, died in 1925, his body was placed here while his tomb was being constructed. And so this area, this building, still functions as a Sun Yat-sen memorial. And so in front, this is what it looks like today. So this is the altar where supplications would have been made to the soil and to grain, and this is now the Sun Yat-sen Memorial. And so it's not exactly the capital I shape. Just one more picture, the altar to earth. Because I want to end with how it is and what it took for this city with literally millennia of history to become the city that you see today, to become first a 20th and then a 21st century city. And Penn plays a huge role in this. So this is something that if you don't know, something else that you will hear tonight. It begins, as I said, 1820 was the last emperor whose picture I showed. So this is what it takes to go, what it takes to go from here to here. This is a picture of, it happens to be Shanghai around the 1930s. 1839 to 1942, the first Opium War. China loses, treaty ports like Hong Kong open. Second Opium War, 1860, China loses. The Europeans burn the gardens the Jesuits had constructed. During this period, the Boxer Rebellion is raging. This is an anti-government uprising by Chinese Christians, primarily in the south between Nanjing and the city that's today called Guangzhou, once called Canton. The Boxer Rebellion, the picture on the top left is, I think, in every high school world history book used in the United States. Literally everybody wants to carve China. And China's defeated again and understands that she can't go on further. Meanwhile, Manchuria is a problem. The Chinese are fighting the Japanese and the Chinese are fighting the Russians. So when it comes time to pay the 8 powers to which China lost in the Boxer Rebellion, the United States government does something that we can really be proud of to this day, and sometimes it's hard to find things that we're proud of that our government does. But in the year 1900, the US government said that instead of taking money from China, they would require that China use the money to pay for scholarships for Chinese students to come to the United States and study subjects that were not readily available in China. Biology, physics, engineering, and architecture was one of those subjects. They weren't designated that way, but those were the subjects most often studied. A 9 through 12 school called Tsinghua Preparatory School was built on what's today Tsinghua University campus. All the classes were taught in English. It then became Tsinghua College, and it prepared students to come to the United States. So this is one of the groups of students leaving China to come to the United States. This picture is probably taken around 1920. It's about a 10-year period when the students come. 3 of the most famous recipients of Boxer Indemnity Fellowships are Feng Youlan, who spent a year at Penn in the philosophy department, but he returns and he becomes president of Tsinghua University. Hu Shi was at Columbia. He and Feng Youlan both studied with John Dewey. He returns to become the president of Beijing University. And Liang Sicheng comes to Penn and studies architecture. Now, what's going on at this time? Well, I've shown you the Forbidden City. I showed you a picture of an architectural manual. But the Chinese language has no word for architect, the classical language, just a word for craftsman, builder. There are guidebooks, there are craftsmen, but there's no concept of design. So we can liken this period to the painting on the left was painted, it was a wall painting, painted at the end of the 19th century. What the transformation can be likened to a world of the pagoda becoming a world of the military tower, or a Chinese family where the father's wearing European dress, children are wearing Chinese dress, calligraphy hangs in the background, and this is Liang Sicheng as a child who will be coming to Penn. Now, those of you who know China say, well, but there was European architecture in China. There was. Shamian was a treaty port, Guangzhou. Shanghai was a treaty port. Architecture was designed by Europeans for Europeans, but there wasn't Chinese participation. So the students who came to Penn studied with this man, Paul Kray, who had been recruited by the dean of the Penn School of Design in the year 1903. Paul Kray designed buildings like you see here, like the Rodin Museum, buildings that you see here, Cincinnati Railroad Station, the bridge over the Wissahickon. He had trained at l'École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He had studied design like this, and the dean of the Paris Opera House is probably the most representative building of what was being constructed in Europe that was sought for the education of an architect here. So just visually, what the students saw when they came, and more than 20 came to Penn. In fact, more architects came to Penn than any other program in the United States. There were a few at Cornell, few in Minnesota, a few in Illinois. Beaux-Arts, Beaux-Arts China, Beaux-Arts China, Beaux-Arts China, just visually. So the top is Beaux-Arts and the bottom is China. Just visually, as it turned out, there is a compatibility of a formal, frontal, symmetrical building, this grand tradition with what people saw in China. This is the graduating class of 1927. This is Louis Kahn, and this is a Chinese student whose name was Yang Tingbao. And as I said, their teacher is Paul Kray. I have his name and date here. He designed the Barnes Foundation in Marion was designed by him. You see Paul Kray buildings all over Philadelphia and all over Washington, D.C. His studio master, John Harbison, wrote this textbook that the Chinese students used, and in the textbook is the picture on the left, which was a prize-winning drawing by a Chinese student for a marketplace in the city of Philadelphia. And if this looks a little bit like the Penn Museum, this is what is being taught in school. Every student except one, who this design school has lost track of, went back to China with a 5-part mission and mandate to build China. And the 5 parts would be how to be an architect, how to build a new China, historic preservation. They set up the first schools of architecture, and they made field trips into the countryside to find old buildings. And part 6 would be the study of texts. So Liang Sicheng, the man who emerges as Penn's first architect of the first generation, he doesn't look so good. In the picture on the left, he was around 50. He goes back to China in 1928 or 29, and he gets a job in the city that's today Shenyang. At that time, it was called Mukden. And he gets into battle in the newspaper with the mayor, who is about to tear down a building because he wants the traffic to flow better. And Liang Sicheng says, if you tear down an old building, you know, you can never replace it. But the mayor does tear down the building, but within a year, there's a student uprising called the Mukden Incident. University closes. He goes to Beijing. This man founds the Society for Research in Chinese Architecture. Liang and his group go on field trips. He finds old buildings like you see here. They found, measured, studied buildings like this. China, the Japanese begin bombings. The research institutes, Beijing, Tsinghua, institutes in Nanjing, have to regroup in the south. He goes to Kunming and eventually to Lijiang in Sichuan, where this picture was taken, Three Gorges region. He collaborates with this man who's older than he is, who had trained in Tokyo. They have some student apprentices. They find buildings in the south. The war's over. He comes back to the United States. His English was perfect, and he's on the verge of having a world-class career. Not only is he the only Chinese who attended this conference, that's what the field looked like in 1947, he's on the International Commission to design the UN. He is representing China. And then 1949 comes. And 1949, what people tell you initially about the People's Liberation Army is that they were extremely kind to the population. No, everybody was starving. They didn't take food from people who didn't have it. The People's Liberation Army sends a representative to Liang Sicheng, and they say, we're going to have to do some work on the Forbidden City, on the city of Beijing. What buildings should we absolutely not tear down? And so Liang gave them a list, and he worked with this man, Chen Zhengqiang, who lived much longer. Liang Sicheng dies in 1971. As I said, he didn't look very good in the picture that I showed you. They designed the Liangchun plan to preserve all of this. The arrows are funny in this picture, but this was going to be a new administrative center, and the historic center, in other words, they were going to keep everything intact. But by this point, and so there are lots of pictures from that, by this point, China has already hired Soviet advisors. 1949, China announces an alliance with the USSR, whereby China will receive $300 million in low-interest loans for 156 large-scale industrial projects that bring 20,000 Soviet advisors to China. And the criticism of what they saw was that Moscow was 25% a worker city, and Beijing was only 4% worker city. And it's much cheaper to tear down than to engage in historic preservation. So Liang makes a presentation to the mayor of the city of Beijing, this man, Peng Zhan, and tells him they must preserve the Forbidden City. Peng Zhan reports to Mao that this is a liberal who has bourgeois tendencies, and he's been educated in the United States. We're not going to do this. So Liang Sicheng goes to see Zhou Enlai. And nobody knows who this person is. And Zhou Enlai knew Liang before, but nothing happens. And so between in the first years of the 1950s, between 1951 and 1959, the entire outer wall of the southern part of Beijing, the entire wall of the outer city, was dismantled. 30 to 50,000 square meters of houses are torn down. Between 1957 and 1960, 30 cultural heritage relics are destroyed, just in the city of Beijing. 4,922 sites under government protection are destroyed. 54 kilometers of the Great Wall near the city of Beijing are taken down. More than 305,100 cultural relics are looted, and 31 of Beijing's gates are torn down. That's why we have to use these old pictures, including this gate, which stood until 1976, Cultural Revolution, that Kublai Khan had built. So Liang's life and everything that he had learned about historic preservation and about the great tradition of the classical European building being imitated and emulated through history was shattered. His life, he himself also suffered greatly. So now the Soviets come to Tsinghua University, where he set up an architecture department and teaching. And they can't believe how quickly the students are learning. They tell Liang, I almost don't have to teach anything. That's because the buildings that stood in Moscow in the 1930s through 1950s were built by Beaux-Arts trained architects who had gone as Russians to study in Paris in the 18th and 19th century. So you can look at the dates and you can look at the pictures. These buildings came up in Beijing under Soviet direction in the 50s, but they're really Beaux-Arts buildings of the kind that Paul Kray was building in Philadelphia and in Washington, D.C. So that if you don't have the Chinese label, you don't know that the one on the right is in Moscow and the one on the left is in Beijing within this, what comes to be the inner city. Liang is greatly persecuted. He does manage to join the Communist Party, and he dies in his hospital bed writing confessions of why he's not a good communist. He and his wife together designed the emblem of China. These are four buildings that he built. This is his father's mausoleum, which is modeled after a Paul Kray building in Flanders Field built after the First World War. He educates what will be the second generation of Chinese architects, and anything that is preserved in the Forbidden City today is preserved because of him. He is, of course, exonerated. So if you give me about 2 more minutes, I'll finish, because Penn Stadium comes in at the end. So one of Louis Kahn's best friends in school was this man, Yang Tingbao. They graduated together. Yang went back to China and built a 7,000 square meter railroad station in 1927. It took Louis Kahn 6 years to get his first commission, and he was a certified genius. It was a storefront synagogue in northeast Philly. He's a historic preservationist, but he is in the South. He's in Nanjing, which had been controlled by the nationalist government and was never the political hotbed that Beijing was. So he builds buildings like this in Nanjing. He designs the university. He designs the largest cinema in China. And take a look, because if you feel you're looking across the street at Franklin Field, Yang Tingbao, who got his degree at Penn, built a stadium in the city of Nanjing that's still used today as an active stadium, as ours is. So Penn he builds this music, he builds a Greek amphitheater in the city of Nanjing. Nanjing did not lose its wall. Nanjing was a city where the Ming Dynasty wall of the Hongwu Emperor, the father of Yongle, still stands, and the city managed to gracefully come into the 20th and 21st centuries. He redesigned Sichuan University, railroad stations, department stores, all with this Beaux-Arts thrust, the formalism, the symmetry, the towers. And he lives well into his 80s and leads a prosperous life, and it is because of him that Nanjing managed to survive as a much more intact imperial city. And he was one of the chief designers of the Mao Mausoleum. You have to know where to look, and you see a little plaque. This is the 1970s, so these are group commissions. But that was his model. And a lot of people in China may not be aware of this. This is Paul Kray. This is Beaux-Arts architecture that he learned studying in class at the University of Pennsylvania. So it is through this coincidence of coming to Penn and studying Beaux-Arts that somehow buildings like this can still be seen in what was being erected in the city of Beijing in the 1950s. Liang was not able to save anything of the imperial axis. This is how people were already playing around with it in the 20s, and what you see here is what you see today. But interestingly, Liang Sicheng designed this building, which is the monument to the people's heroes, but it is an obelisk. And Yang Qingbao designed the Mao Mausoleum, and these are both Beaux-Arts-inspired buildings, as is the museum, as is the Great Hall of the People, and the Forbidden City itself survives intact. In order to keep Beijing functioning, the first thing that people did was change the axis, so that the longest street in China today is Chang'an Avenue, and no longer is this the main axis. And then they built ring roads around the city that are supposed to move as fast as highways to keep things going. But the fact is, the Forbidden City has now become the center of contemporary China and functions as you see it if you go there now as a tourist. And that very much is due to the sacrifice of Liang Sicheng, who studied here, and the Beaux-Arts tradition. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions. I kept our class a little bit longer, but I wanted to talk about Liang and the Beaux-Arts, so feel free to leave, and if you have anything you want to ask me, I'm happy to answer questions formally or informally. There's a question. Yeah, just a question.
Was there any actual business Beijing before the 20th century? Was there actually, other than being an administrative center, how'd you make a living in Beijing?
Storekeeper, shop owner, factory worker. All the commerce is Shanghai. And then once the treaty ports open, after the Opium Wars, Canton is open, Shanghai is open, Minzhou's open. There are ports where the kind of business that we think of as international commerce are taking place, but not Beijing. All right. Well, you can come up and ask me questions if you want. If not, thank you very much.